Hello, and welcome to the St. Louis Art Museum's Art Speaks program. My name is Jessica Kennedy, and I'm the educator for adult learning at the museum. Before we begin, please familiarize yourself with the Q&A section located on your screen. Feel free to enter your questions at any time during the program, and we will choose a few to answer at the end. Also, there is live auto transcription available for this program. Please click the CC icon to activate or deactivate the subtitles. For today's talk, Edmonia Lewis, Sculpting Her Path Forward, we are joined by Charlie Farrell, the 2022 to 2024 Romare Bearden Graduate Museum Fellow. Thanks for being here today, Charlie.
Thank you for that introduction, Jessica. So my name is Charlie Farrell, and I am the 2022-2024 Romare Bearden Graduate Museum Fellow. I am so honored and privileged to be here this afternoon, and thank you so much, everyone, for spending your lunch with me. This afternoon, I will be discussing Edmonia Lewis, her life, and her work. Lewis was the first Afro-Indigenous sculptor to reach international acclaim, first in the United States and then later in Rome, Italy. There were a lot of barriers for people of color and women during the 19th century who wanted to become artists. So as we begin this talk, I find it most interesting to start towards the end of the story to more fully celebrate her triumphs and the culmination of a life of arduous work and dedication to her dream. Edmonia Lewis was a woman who understood the power of story and persisted despite unfavorable circumstances. I hope to inspire you all to learn more about her and other women artists who may have faded from public memory. Additionally, I wish to impress upon you all that Edmonia Lewis was a complex woman. There's ongoing research to discover more about her life and her work, and there are still existing gaps to fill. So let's start with the death of Cleopatra, which would have been Edmonia Lewis's monumental work. This was created for the Philadelphia Centennial Exposition in 1876, celebrating 100 years of the United States. Edmonia Lewis was one of two Black artists who were invited to participate in the exposition. During this time, artists felt that to celebrate their career, they need to create a monumental work that was oftentimes female. And Cleopatra was a popular subject during the time. Edmonia Lewis received mixed reviews for this piece. She did a lot of research that focused on Cleopatra's heritage. When she was living in Rome, Italy, she would have had access to Roman coins, and so she modeled her Cleopatra after a Roman woman. The positive reviews focused on the remarkably executed sculpture and the research that she did, as you can notice by the sandals and their hieroglyphics on this statue, on the sculpture that we can't see, and her headdress. The more negative reviews focused on what they would have interpreted as her lack of skill. Sorry, I clicked ahead too early. Edmonia Lewis's Cleopatra is also would have been a bit jarring for audiences. So we see Cleopatra depicted in the act of dying, which would have surprised audiences of this time. Audiences would have been more accustomed to seeing Cleopatra as a languid, regal figure and we can see that compared to another Cleopatra sculpted during this time by William Wetmore Story that was also exhibited in the Philadelphia Centennial Exposition. So we see on the left, Edmonia Lewis's Cleopatra does not have the elegance and the regalness. She's already committed the act of suicide and is dying, versus Wetmore Story's Cleopatra, who's contemplating suicide. Lewis's Cleopatra also would have been interesting during this time because, as I mentioned before, she depicted Cleopatra as a Roman woman based on her research versus Wetmore's story, who depicted Cleopatra as a Black African. And audiences during this time would have picked up on that. So I'm just going to move my cursor over her face. So we see Story's Cleopatra has plump lips and a wider nose, which audiences at the time would have read as Black African. So who is Edmonia Lewis? Edmonia Lewis was born in 1844 in what is now Rensselaer, New York, on July 4th. She was born free to a Haitian father and a Black and Ojibwe mother. When Lewis was 9, both of her parents had passed away, and she lived with a period of time with her aunt selling baskets. She credited this time in her life as being free and wild. After her parents passed away, her older brother goes west during the gold rush and makes it big, and he's able to fund her education. So for a period of time, Edmonia Lewis attends the New York Central College between 1856 and 1858, and then she later moves on to Oberlin College in 1859 to 1863, where she did prep courses before moving on to the college level. Oberlin College was in Ohio, and it was the first school in the United States to grant equal educational opportunities regardless of race. But students of color at Oberlin were in small number, and there was not a large social pressure to integrate. And so Edmonia Lewis was a bit isolated from her peers during this time. She stayed with Reverend John Keep, who was on the board of Oberlin, and other students while she was studying. While she is at Oberlin, she is accused of poisoning her classmates who went on a date unattended, and this gets escalated to trial. The case was eventually dismissed because they could not prove that Lewis had actually poisoned her classmates. But while the case was at trial, she was a victim of mob violence because not all of the residents in Oberlin were abolitionists, and they felt that the trial was moving too slow, and so they chose to take matters into their own hands. She was a victim of mob violence and left out in the cold. Thankfully, she was found in enough time where she could get medical attention, but this was not her last encounter with discrimination while she was at Oberlin. About a year later, she was accused of stealing art supplies and was disallowed from re-enrolling in her last semester. She was not kicked out, but she wasn't allowed to re-enroll, so she wasn't able to complete her studies at Oberlin. So after this, she moved to Boston in 1864, where she started sculpting. On this slide, this is the one surviving sketch that we have by Lewis. This was a gift to a friend of hers, and I just want to bring our attention to it. So Lewis did not have a lot of training sculpting, but she did have a good understanding of anatomy, and I feel that this sketch illustrates that. So while in Boston, she fell in with the abolitionists. They were her big supporters, and that's how she was able to get her start sculpting. She studied under another sculptor, Edward Brackett, for a bit, but abruptly starts working solo. Some abolitionists that she got to know in Boston were Lydia Marie Childs, Elizabeth Peabody, Anne Quincy Watterson, and Laura Curtis Bullard. And we can see here's a bust of Anne Quincy Watterson, who would have supported Lewis while she was in Boston. One of her big successful early works was this bust of Robert Gould Shaw, who was a Civil War hero who was killed a year prior to this. This bust was so popular that Shaw's family allowed her to create plaster molds that she was then able to sell, which she used to raise money for her move to Rome. While she was very popular in abolitionist circles, Lewis was not free of the infantilization that followed women of color during this time. And though Lydia Marie Childs was a very big supporter of Lewis in personal letters, she talks about how Lewis is a bit too eager and needs more training, and associates attributes that she's not fond of to Lewis's race. And Lewis did at times play into these tropes about her heritage as perhaps as a way to stay relevant in these circles. And so she claimed that she had never seen a sculpture before moving to Boston, and that's how she knew what she wanted to do. And she also claimed that she grew up very wild among her mother's people. But historians, based on research, don't think that's 100% accurate. And we know that though she was highly celebrated in abolitionist circles, she did feel those restrictions, and that is really what pushed her into moving to Rome. And we can see that in her own words. Some praise me because I am a colored girl. I do not want that kind of praise. I'd rather you point out my defects, for that will teach me something. And she says of her move to Rome, I was practically driven to Rome in order to obtain the opportunities for art and art culture and to find a social atmosphere where I was not constantly reminded of my color. The land of liberty had no room for a colored sculpture. So she really did feel pushed to move to Rome to receive more opportunities. She arrived in Italy in 1865. And while in Italy, she rejected suggestions for more technical training because she was worried that she was going to be accused of not doing her own work. So during this time, sculptors would make a mold of their work, but then they would have craftspeople who would actually sculpt into the marble. Lewis did all of her sculpting into the marble to avoid these claims. While she was in Italy, she became very familiar with a circle of other American female sculptor expats, like Harriet Hobsner, who was accused of not doing her own work during this time. And so Lewis really wanted to avoid this. While she was in Rome, many of her clients were back in the United States, and she still had contacts in the United States who were doing more of the business aspect for her. Excuse me. So here are some of the works that she created while she was in Rome. On the left, we have Poor Cupid, which depicts the love god Cupid ensnared. On the right, we have Hagar, who is a woman from the Old Testament who led a difficult life. She was enslaved to Sarah and Abraham and was a surrogate for the couple. She was treated so poorly, she fled into the desert. And this is what this scene's depicting. Behind her, we can see this felled pitcher, perhaps with water falling out of it. A theme that we see in Lewis's work is a visualization of suffering women, which Hagar would have been. Oops. Right here we have Forever Free, created in 1867 after the Emancipation Proclamation. This was one of the first works she created in Rome, Italy. This work is commemorating the emancipation, but during the time it was very common for Black men to be on their knees or on the ground. And this work, she has the Black man with his chains broken and his fist raised to the sky, standing. His hand is on the shoulder of the woman, which may be reinscribing a natural difference between men and women. And might allude to the hierarchy. This difference in hierarchy might allude to the fact that Black men and women could now participate in Christian ideals of gender and hierarchy. So we now have Black men who are able to participate as a man husband seen as protector, and his woman or wife who can be protected. This would not have been allowed during enslavement. The woman besides him is kneeling with her hands clasped and looking up, and she's modestly dressed, and this is perhaps to align Black womanhood with Christian womanhood that Black women could now fully participate in, which would not have been allowed when they were enslaved. And the next work I want to focus on is Marriage of Hiawatha. This was based on a very popular epic poem by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. So this scene is depicting Hiawatha and his wife Minnehaha after they get married. And it's an epic poem about Hiawatha's adventures and the tragedy of his relationship. And I want to clarify briefly about this poem that this was a product of Longfellow's imagination and not representative of Native peoples or in their oral histories and stories. The Hiawatha here is an Ojibwe hero, but the historical Hiawatha would have been one of the founders of the Iroquois League. And when talking about Lewis's work depicting Black and Indigenous figures, I want to avoid reducing her to her Afro-Indigenous heritage in regards to her subject matter. Her work should not be read as simply biographical. There's no such thing as an inherent Black or Indigenous sensibility. And when we're thinking and talking about her work, we should really consider all the factors that would have influenced the artistic decisions that she was making. We know that Lewis did not want to be seen solely through the lens of her race. And as such, her work of African-American and Indigenous subjects should not be reduced to that, because then we lose her autonomy as an artist. Oops. Moving on to work that she created later in her career, we have Portrait of a Woman that is in the St. Louis Art Museum's collections, currently on view in Gallery 336. It's very difficult to do this sculpture justice, but I encourage you all to go see it in person since it is on view. We can see the delicate lacing and the flowers that would have shown Lewis's really good control of the medium. This woman is currently unidentified, but there is ongoing research to identify her. And on the right, we have a bust of James Peck Thomas. This is the only known bust of an African-American subject whose location is known. And just as a fun St. Louis connection, James Peck Thomas was at a point in time one of the richest Black men in St. Louis. So her post-Cleopatra years, not much is known about her later years. She continued to work through the 1880s. Her commissions declined as the neoclassical style became less popular, but she was not less of a celebrity. In 1877, former US President Ulysses Grant sat for her as a portrait during his visit to Rome. She was also a tour guide for Frederick Douglass and his wife when they stayed in Rome in 1887. And her last known visit to the United States was in 1897 to present a bust of Charles Sumner, who was a US Senator. Lewis died on September 17th, 1907 in London. So to round out this presentation, why is Lewis important? She was incredibly popular during her time, was a celebrity during her time, and she was a master of creating her own story, and really had a vision and stuck to it despite unfavorable circumstances, and refused to be constrained, and refused to allow others to dictate what was and was not possible. If you're interested in doing further research, I have some of the books I read in preparation for this presentation on this screen. That concludes my presentation, and I'm ready to take questions.
Wonderful. Thank you, Charlie. That was great. So folks, if you have questions, please go ahead and type those into the Q&A box. I will be monitoring that. In the meantime, I actually have a few questions for you. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the death of Cleopatra and how that was found. That's kind of an interesting story.
Yes. So let me go back so we could see it. Too far. So after it was exhibited at the Philadelphia Exposition, it was actually up for sale, did not sell, and then was exhibited in the Chicago Exposition in the Exposition in the 1890s and did not sell. And it appeared at a saloon in Chicago in 1982 and was bought by a man named Blind John Condon, who was a gambler, who sent the sculpture to the Harlem Racetrack in Forest Park, Chicago. He placed it on the grave of his horse that was also named Cleopatra. In the 1920s, it was the racetrack was remodeled as a golf course. The Cleopatra statue did not move. There was a clause in his will that said that the horse's grave should not be disturbed. And around 1971, the USPS got the property and the sculpture was moved to a salvage yard. In 1985, Fire Chief Harold Adams rediscovered her, moved her, attempted conservation on her, which included painting her pink/flesh colored. But he sort of understood the historical significance. So in 1988, the Forest Park Historical Society moved her to a nearby shopping mall. When the mall changed owners, they put her back into storage. But Marilyn Richardson, who's one of the big Edmonia Lewis scholars, made the identification, and the Forest Park Historical Society donated Cleopatra to the Smithsonian. So she's been all around.
That's a lot. That's a lot of traveling for such a large sculpture. Well, thank you. Okay, so we do have quite a few questions here, so we will see how many we can get to. Let's see, lots of folks saying thank you for your presentation. And someone has asked, do you know when Miss Lewis moved from Rome to London? You mentioned when she passed away, she was in London.
I don't know exactly when she moved, but we do know by 1901 she was in London.
Okay, so for the last few years of her life.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Thank you, Charlie, for your presentation. What inspired you to do this presentation on Edmonia Lewis?
Oh, that's a great question. Thank you for asking. I really wanted to, for my first Art Speaks at the museum, I really wanted to talk a bit about a Black woman artist. And I wanted to dive deeper into Lewis's story. And as I was doing research, I'm like, wow, she's really interesting. I want to talk about her.
Yeah. Great, thank you. Someone else has asked, did Lewis ever marry or have any children?
We don't have any record of her marrying or having children. There was a newspaper clipping that announced her engagement, but that was never mentioned again. So she was engaged at some point. Okay. I don't know if she got married. Good question.
Yeah, interesting. Let's see. So someone has asked if we know, and I don't know if we know this, but so who, I guess at SLAM you mentioned they're conducting more research about our bust. Do you know, well, one, do you know who's doing that research? And if there's any updates, any information that you have learned from that?
Amy Torbert is conducting that research. I know a previous fellow, Victoria McCraven, was also doing research into this bust. When an identification is ready to be announced, I think American will announce that. So stay tuned.
Great. Yeah, so we'll wait for our American curators to make an announcement. Let's see. Sorry, this is fantastic. Okay, speaking of Amy Torbert, this is from her. She says, thank you, Charlie. Congrats on a great presentation. If you had a magic wand and/or all the money and time in the world, what are your top, say, 3 research questions about Edmonia Lewis that you'd hope to find answers for?
Ooh, top 3. Okay. So my first one would be, let me go to, so Forever Free, scholars have noticed, and with a lot of Lewis's work that depicts non-white subjects, they've noticed that she has a tendency to de-ethnicize the women in her work. And I'd like to ask her, why is she making that artistic decision? Second question I'd ask Lewis is if she could speak just more about her life. We have newspaper clippings, but from my research, she seemed very tight-lipped about her specific thoughts and feelings on things. And so I'm just curious to know more about like her time in Boston with the abolitionists. And how was it, I guess, and third question, how was it moving to Rome? Like that must have been a big culture shock. So things you like, things you didn't like.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. All right. Hope Amy took some notes there as the research is happening. Let's see. Someone said, I read that there were some people who were trying to move her body from England to the US. Do you know are there any updates on that, or did you read anything about that?
Oh, I'd not heard that they were trying to move her.
There you go, some more to research. Okay, so I think I'm gonna look at our time here. All right, I'm gonna pick a couple more here. Lots of thank yous. Someone has asked, and I think that you covered this, but was she able to earn her living by selling her works eventually?
Yes, she was, and she also sold plaster busts. So I mentioned the Robert Gould Shaw bust that she would have sold, and Poor Cupid would have been replicated as a plaster bust. And she did larger commissions. Her last large commission was, let me just get the title right, was Adoration of the Magi. Should have been a larger commission. Yeah, she did commissions throughout her life, so she would have earned money for that. But
someone else has asked, do you know if she ever taught? Do you know if she ever had students or even like unofficial like followers who learned from her?
I don't know. That is a good question.
Okay. All right, and I think this is going to be our last question. So, how long would it have taken to sculpt these large pieces? I mean, I don't know if that's in records anywhere. And did her brother continue to fund her art? So you mentioned that he was able to fund her kind of going to school. Do you know if that relationship continued?
So it would have taken her a few years for Death of Cleopatra. It took at least 2 years for her to do, and then she had to ship it over to the United States. I don't know if her brother supported her work during her life, but like he did send her money sometimes. He sort of settled out west, and they would write letters to one another, but I cannot recall if she ever visited him once he settled, but he died pretty young as well. But he was, her first supporter, and if she needed anything, he would have given it.
Yeah, well, that's nice. That's great. That's a good relationship. Okay, so thank you, Charlie. I just want to again say thank you for doing this presentation. Thanks to everyone who came to listen. You did mention some other previous Bearden Fellows. I mean, if you want to give a plug about the fellowship, you're welcome to, but we would just encourage people to, I think the applications are open now, am I right?
Yes, applications will be open through February 28th. So if you're interested in doing work like this, doing research with the St. Louis Art Museum and their collections, encourage you to apply. Awesome. It's a great place to work, yeah.
Yeah, I was saying we have such a long line of fantastic folks like you. All right, well, thank you very much. And I am going to also put in a plug for another Bearden Fellow. So if you'd like, you can register to join us on Tuesday, February 28th at noon to hear the museum's other current Romare Bearden Graduate Museum Fellow, Shaka Myrick, as she honors the legacy of artist Norman Lewis's activism and acoustic aesthetic of his artwork. So I hope people are able to join us for that. And I hope folks are able to come to the museum and see the bust in person. Thanks, everyone, and have a great day.
Thank you.